At one of the most prestigious private schools in Washington, D.C., a place filled with the children of politicians, CEOs, and ambassadors, a 10-year-old boy named Julian Ellison wanted just one thing: to be treated with respect, like any other student. But when Julian stood up in class and said that his father was a defense strategist working at the Pentagon, all he received in return was sneers, mocking laughter, condescending looks, and even open ridicule from his own homeroom teacher. What they didn't know was that this father, Graham Ellison, wasn't just an ordinary parent. He was a high-ranking figure in U.S. intelligence, and he was about to expose the entire shadow network behind that prejudice and drag it into the light. A child wrongfully doubted, a father deeply disrespected, and a covert operation launched in the middle of a classroom that appeared harmless. This journey will uncover buried truths, deliver stunning reversals, and reveal a lesson America can no longer ignore. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to update our latest videos. The small but tidy kitchen inside a quiet suburban townhouse welcomed the first rays of daylight. The alarm clock buzzed at 6:15 a.m., waking Julian Ellison from a fitful sleep. He was 10 years old, a fifth grader at Westbridge Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Washington, D.C., a place filled with the children of politicians, diplomats, and the elite. Julian stretched and sat up, reaching for his neatly hung uniform beside the bed. Dark green and blue stripes, silver shoulder tabs, white collar. It looked far more mature than his age. But as he stepped into the bathroom, the eyes staring back at him in the mirror held a quiet anxiety. Today was career presentation day, when students spoke to the class about their parents' professions. For most of his classmates, it was just another chance to boast: whose dad was a lawyer, whose mum was a CEO, whose uncle was an ambassador. But for Julian, it was more complicated. Because every time he said, "My dad works at the Pentagon," adults and peers alike would look at him differently, not with admiration, but with suspicion. "Julian, come down for breakfast." His father's voice echoed from the kitchen, deep, clear, commanding, yet warm when speaking to his son. Julian adjusted his collar, then whispered to his reflection, "This time, I'll say it all. They have to believe me." Downstairs, Graham Ellison stood by the stove, one hand pouring coffee, the other resting an iPad on a wall-mounted stand, reading defense briefings. Even dressed casually in a polo and khakis, his presence was sharp and composed, shoulders squared, eyes constantly scanning the space. Instincts honed from decades coordinating top-secret operations at the Pentagon. Julian sat at the table. In front of him, a plate of sunny side-up eggs, 2 slices of toast, and a few wedges of red apple. His father had made breakfast, like he did every morning. "You remember what you're presenting today?" Graham asked, eyes still on the screen. "Yes, about your job." Julian nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think they'll believe me?" Graham paused reading, set the iPad aside. He looked directly at his son, eyes serious but not cold. "Julian, we don't live to make others believe us. We live to stand by what's right, even when they doubt." Julian looked down, silent. His small hands clenched the edge of his napkin. He'd heard his father say things like that many times, lofty, noble truths. But today all he really wanted was something simpler: to be believed. Graham seemed to sense that. He placed a firm, gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "But if they need a reason to believe, then today you tell them clearly what I do. And if anyone mocks you, look them straight in the eye." The truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to stand firm. Julian nodded, but in his eyes lingered a quiet doubt. Would anyone really want to listen? 7:30 a.m. Graham drove his silver sedan toward the school. Along the way, they passed lines of luxury SUVs and expensive sports cars parked along the boulevard leading up to Westbridge Academy. The school looked like a fortress of the privileged, tall iron gates, stone-tiled rooftops, a stately flag court at the heart of a marble plaza. Julian stepped out of the car. He straightened his backpack and gave his dad a nod. Graham nodded back. Be confident. But as Julian turned and walked through the school gate, the sound of laughter and chatter from inside made him pause. For a split second, his stride faltered. Because in that world, Julian knew all too well, every difference is examined, even when that difference is the truth. Class 5A at Westbridge Academy looked like a miniature auditorium that morning. Outside, spring sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, casting a glow onto the rows of polished wooden desks. Inside, the room buzzed with excited chatter, students eagerly discussing their upcoming family career presentations. My dad just flew in from Brussels this morning to talk about diplomacy, Sophia Green boasted. Well, my dad just closed a $70 million deal with a Japanese firm, Tyler Drayton declared, hands on hips, chin raised like he had signed the contract himself. Amid the prestigious names and the tailored suits of powerful parents, Julian Ellison sat silently. He dug his fingers gently into the edge of his desk, eyes fixed on the board ahead, but his ears couldn't help absorbing every word of the boasts around him. Then the classroom door opened. Ms. Whitaker, their homeroom teacher, strode in with purposeful steps. A beige-fitted dress, sharp heels clicking with each stride. Her blonde hair twisted neatly into a bun, lips painted crimson. Everything about her exuded control, even over other people's emotions. Good morning, everyone, she said sweetly, though her eyes swept quickly across the room as if scanning for weakness. Today is a special day. I look forward to hearing about some real professions, she added, putting clear emphasis on the word real, her eyes landing coldly on Julian like a bead of mercury tracing down his spine. The presentations followed alphabetical order. It wasn't long before the name Julian Ellison was called, and his heart pounded like a war drum at a tribunal. He stood, slowly walking to the front. His hands trembled slightly, but he kept his gaze steady. Good morning, Ms. Whitaker. Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about my father's job. He paused briefly, took a deep breath. My father is a national security strategist. He works at the Pentagon. A strange silence gripped the room. Exactly 2 seconds of stillness. Then a derisive snort echoed from the back row. The Pentagon? You mean he mops floors there? Tyler sneered. Laughter erupted. Whispers quickly spread. Probably just runs paper around. Or maybe kitchen staff. Security guard, more like it. Julian stood frozen. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the laughter or the ambiguous, condescending glance from Ms. Whitaker. But what came next was worse. Ms. Whitaker made no move to stop the mockery. Instead, she took a step forward, folding her arms with a smile laced in theatrical surprise. Fascinating, Julian. And what does your father do at the Pentagon? Is he perhaps a senior advisor to the president? The class burst into laughter again, louder this time. Julian tried to keep his footing. His voice wavered, but he replied, he works on critical infrastructure protection strategy, cybersecurity, and national risk surveillance. but he didn't get to finish. Ms. Whitaker had already folded her arms, gently shaking her head as if closing the book on a fairy tale. Childhood imagination really does fly far, doesn't it? But remember, this presentation is about truth, everyone. Marcus Boyd, Julian's only close friend, couldn't take it anymore. He stood up abruptly. "That's not fair. Julian's telling the truth. I've seen his dad's badge. It's real, with a security clearance code and everything." The room went still. Ms. Whitaker turned toward Marcus, her smile gone. "Marcus Boyd," she said slowly, "you are disrupting the class. One more word, and you'll stay after school to write a formal statement." Marcus bit his lip, wanting to speak, but sat down, defeated. Julian looked over at his friend, his eyes filled with gratitude and guilt. At the front of the room, Julian stood alone, surrounded by laughter, probing stares, and a teacher who had just dismissed everything he believed was true. He lowered his head and walked back to his seat. And in that moment, a different feeling took root inside him. Anger. Not just from humiliation, but because his truth, and his father's truth, had been stomped on like a careless joke. And deep in his mind, a silent vow began to form. If they won't believe my words, they'll have to believe their eyes. The air inside the car was thick like lead as Julian sat beside his father, his small hand clenched tightly around his backpack strap. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were clouded, the kind of silent hurt that even Graham Ellison, a man who had negotiated with military commanders in the Middle East, found hard to endure. "She said I made it up," Julian whispered, his voice like a small cut, slowly bleeding. Everyone laughed. Marcus tried to defend me, but she threatened him with a disciplinary report. Graham tightened his grip on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. "What's the teacher's name?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm. "Whitaker, Ms. Whitaker." Graham nodded. He said nothing more, but in his mind a list was already beginning to form. When they got home, Julian went straight to his room without waiting for a word. Graham remained in the kitchen, phone in hand. The screen lit up with a secure message from the Department of Defense. Alert: attempted unauthorized access to Westbridge Academy's data system. Origin traced to internal student network IP cluster. High-level encryption detected. Immediate risk assessment required. Graham stared at the message. His heart pounded. This couldn't be coincidence. The very day his son was humiliated, when all attention suddenly turned toward the kid who lied about his father, the school's network was being probed. Graham recognized the tactic immediately: create a social distraction to divert attention, while backdoor signals breach the perimeter. A classic intelligence play. Old but effective. He opened an encrypted vault on his device and searched for a name: Agent Jasmine Lin, Senior Counterintelligence Specialist, FBI. The call lasted exactly 18 seconds. No greetings were exchanged. "Westbridge Academy's network was just scanned," Graham said. "Same time my son was isolated. Possible covert infiltration using student accounts. I need a list of all personnel with system-level access: IT, tech staff, maintenance, anyone. Do you have a source?" Jasmine's voice came through, steady and sharp. "I'll have my team map the school's internal network. If someone used a student as an access point, we'll find out." Graham hung up and glanced toward the staircase leading to Julian's room. A soft light glowed under the door. He hadn't turned it off yet. There was no blood on his son's body, but Graham knew a campaign had begun, and the target might not just be Westbridge's data systems. He opened his private laptop, entered a 3-tier passcode, and activated a black screen interface reserved for critical operations. Initiate trace on network breach. Source: student subnet. Target: Julian Ellison. The screen flickered. A red dot lit up on the school network map. Someone had tagged Julian, and Graham Ellison understood. This wasn't about being mocked in class anymore. This was a war, and the enemy had just chosen their battlefield, his son's school. Nights in the quiet suburbs of Washington, D.C. usually carried only the rustle of leaves and the warm amber glow of streetlights cast along the sidewalks. But tonight, Graham Ellison wasn't sleeping. He stood behind the second-floor window curtain, eyes locked on a black SUV parked across the street. The engine was off, no visible movement, yet the windshield reflected the street lamp like a pair of watching eyes. No plates, no movement, Graham whispered. It was past 2 a.m. The vehicle hadn't started once. No one had stepped out. It wasn't FBI. He was sure of that. Upstairs, Julian lay in bed, blanket pulled to his chin. He no longer looked out the window, and he hadn't mentioned the strange car to his mother because she wasn't home. Dr. Isabel Ellison, Julian's mother, was away at a medical conference in Chicago, and though just 10 years old, Julian could already sense something much bigger was happening. Downstairs, Graham opened the floorboard safe. Inside was a military-grade encrypted laptop, completely detached from civilian networks. He connected it to a signal decryption unit, the kind only top-tier intelligence officers had ever seen in real life. Earlier that evening, he'd requested support from the FBI to scan for unusual signals near Westbridge Academy. And just as he suspected, the device belonging to a 5th-grade student, Julian's school tablet, had just emitted a military-grade encrypted sequence. Definitely a planted device, Agent Jasmine Lin had said as she forwarded the data. Now Graham was tracing the source of that sequence. The screen blinked, displaying a stream of technical metadata. Signal source, Classroom 4B, Westbridge Academy. Intermediate device, Samsung EDU, 11 tablet, device ID, Julian Ellison. Data packet, encrypted archive plus background push protocol. Outbound path, port 22, disguised under a routine software update channel. Graham sat motionless for a moment. They're using student devices to infiltrate the internal network, he muttered, and Julian wasn't chosen by accident. Beside the laptop, his phone buzzed, a secure message from Jasmine Lin. Intelligence confirms potential espionage activity at Westbridge. Target may be linked to Blackfish Protocol. Proceed with extreme caution. Graham immediately shut the laptop, resecured everything into the safe, and stepped out into the hallway. He opened Julian's door. The boy was still awake, eyes wide when he saw his father enter. "You saw the SUV, didn't you?" Graham asked, skipping all pretense. Julian nodded. "I noticed it earlier. No one got out." Graham walked over and knelt beside the bed, lowering himself to eye level. "From now on, don't use that tablet anymore. I'll give you a new one. Don't tap any messages. Don't reply to anyone unless I've confirmed them. Got it?" "Because someone's watching me?" Julian asked, voice trembling slightly. Graham didn't respond right away, but his gaze softened. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Possibly, but listen to me. Nothing is going to happen to you. Not at home, not at school, not anywhere. I promise." Julian nodded, but in his eyes, Graham saw something more than fear. He saw a sudden, premature maturity, the first shape of fear clearly defined, and the price of knowing the truth. Outside, the black SUV remained motionless, but Graham had already placed a call to Agent Brandon Lee, an FBI specialist in electronic warfare, and by morning a digital trap would be ready. The war had begun, and this time there were no visible front lines. Only one truth remained. His son was now in the crosshairs. The next morning, Julian Ellison descended the stairs in his crisply pressed Westbridge Academy uniform. He expected to see his father, Graham, reading the news as usual, with a coffee beside him. But this time, his father was standing in front of the living room mirror, tightening the knot of a deep navy blue military uniform. On his chest, a national security strategist insignia. Julian stopped mid-step. This wasn't the version of Graham he usually saw. "Where are you going?" the boy asked, voice low. Graham turned, meeting his son's eyes. His gaze wasn't cold, just deeply focused. "There's business at the Pentagon," he replied curtly. "Is it because of last night?" Julian lowered his voice. "Because of the strange car, or my tablet?" Graham looked at his son for a long moment. He couldn't tell him everything, not because he didn't trust Julian, but because this truth wasn't safe for a 10-year-old to carry. "Julian," he said slowly, "in the world I live in, sometimes the truth is the most dangerous thing." Julian frowned. "I thought truth was something we're supposed to protect." "Exactly," Graham replied, "and sometimes protecting it means knowing when to ask and when not to. It means keeping quiet, staying alert, not getting baited." Julian sat at the table in silence. He wasn't a weak child, but today it felt like the world had cracked open a little, and through the gap he saw something entirely different on the other side. "So, what's your real job?" he asked after a pause. "You don't just write reports, do you?" Graham paused, then walked over and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm part of a group whose job is to stop the worst things from happening before anyone realizes they're coming. And right now, someone is using your school as a tool." Julian's eyes widened. "Because of me?" he exhaled. Graham didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. "You're just one part, but they're testing the smallest doors. And those doors are you, Marcus, the other kids whose parents hold important positions." "Then what do I do?" Julian asked. "Observe, remember. If anything feels off, a teacher asking too many questions, someone trying to borrow your tablet, a classmate getting strange messages, tell me. Don't skip a single detail." Julian nodded. He was no longer the trembling boy from last night. He was learning, fast, how to survive in a world where what you said yesterday could be used as a weapon today. Before leaving the house, Graham made a call to Agent Jasmine Lynn. "I want a full background check on every staff member at Westbridge, teachers, IT personnel, maintenance, janitors, and increased surveillance on Class 5A while I'm at the Pentagon. Let's not give them the illusion they're ahead." "We already started this morning," Lynn replied, "but there's a problem. Surveillance footage from the school server room just recorded something unusual." "What is it?" "A maintenance worker, Dmitry Volkov, entered the room at 5 a.m. with no scheduled reason. He placed a device underneath the main server, then left." Graham's hand clenched around the steering wheel. "Keep the footage untouched. Don't raise any alarms. Let them believe we don't know." "What are you planning?" Lynn asked. Graham's eyes gleamed with a dangerous calm. "I'm going to Westbridge Academy," he said, "and I'm going to make them realize they picked the wrong student to follow." 2 days after Career Day, the atmosphere in the classroom still hadn't returned to normal. Though Julian acted composed, he continued to receive mocking glances and hushed whispers every time he walked down the hallway. Ms. Whitaker made no mention of her public humiliation of the boy. In fact, she seemed satisfied with Julian's prolonged silence. That morning's lesson was social history. The day's topic: how national defense agencies influence civilian life in America. Ms. Whitaker stood at the front of the class and opened with her usual pointed tone. Does anyone here actually know anything about the Pentagon? Or are we still pretending our parents work there just to impress people? The class erupted into stifled giggles. Julian looked up. He didn't raise his hand. He stood up. His voice was calm, but every word sliced through the air like a blade. The Pentagon has over 23,000 employees, both military and civilian. Its operations center is divided into 5 sections. One of them, called the SCIF, oversees national-level cybersecurity threats. It runs 24/7 in times of war and peace. The room fell completely silent. Julian stepped forward into the middle of the classroom, eyes fixed on the teacher. And another thing. During the Cold War, the Soviets believed the hot dog stand in the Pentagon's courtyard was a disguised entrance to a secret underground facility, because too many high-ranking officers went there every day. They considered targeting it with a missile. Turns out it was just the lunch spot. A few students laughed, this time genuinely. Ms. Whitaker's hands clenched on the desk. Very entertaining, Julian, she said tightly. You're sure you have all those details right? Yes, it's all public information. Anyone could find it, if they actually tried. The teacher went quiet. A flash of defiance flickered in her eyes. Then she narrowed them. If your father really works at the Pentagon, fine. Parents' Day is coming up. Invite him to class. Let him explain it all himself. Deal? Julian didn't respond right away, but inside he already knew. This time, the battle would be real. After the tense lesson, Julian didn't go home right away. He sat alone in the library, eyes fixed on the Parents' Day posters pinned along the hallway. The morning's events still simmered inside him. Ms. Whitaker's challenging gaze, the classmates' muffled giggles, and that cold declaration, invite your father to speak to the class, if he even exists the way you say. That evening, in the family kitchen, Julian sat across from his father, Graham Ellison, the man his entire school suspected, mocked, and imagined as everything but the truth. Dad, Julian began, voice slightly hoarse, can you come to Parents' Day? Ms. Whitaker, the class, they think I'm lying. Graham looked up from his secure tablet, its screen displaying complex defense strategy models and encrypted algorithmic forecasts. He didn't respond immediately. His face was still unreadable, but inside a cold fury was beginning to stir. You always say safety comes first, Julian continued. But this time, if you don't show up, I won't be safe there anymore. Not because of terrorists, but because of the humiliation, every single day. Graham nodded slowly. You don't want me to show up to impress them, he said. You want me to show up so they'll finally believe you. Isn't that right? Julian nodded. Slow, steady. Graham stood, walked over to a locked cabinet, the one where he kept things he never carried into the public. He unlocked it and pulled out a Tier 1 military ID, along with a black tier security badge, reserved for strategic personnel with access to the black tier of the national defense infrastructure. I'll be there, he said. And this time, I'm not just coming as a father, I'm coming as a message to those who deny truth just because your skin isn't the shade they're used to seeing. Julian felt something in his chest lighten. the first release of breath in days. But just as the tension began to ease, a secure message popped up on Graham's laptop from Agent Jasmine Lynn. She reported that a female janitor at Westbridge Academy had just been flagged by infrared sensors planting surveillance devices in the third-floor server room. And the suspected handler was Dmitry Volkov, the maintenance technician. Graham frowned. "They've started," he muttered, eyes still fixed on the screen. "What's started, Dad?" Julian asked. Graham turned to his son and smiled faintly. "A war you haven't seen yet, but you're already standing in the middle of it." Westbridge Academy had never been this bustling. Parents' Day, the unofficial showcase, where CEOs, senators, and international investors were invited to speak to students, flaunt achievements, and share their personal philosophies of success. Luxury cars lined up in front of the school gates. Bentleys, Maseratis, one after another. Security guards bowed their heads to each six-figure suit that passed through. Julian Ellison stepped out of a modest grey sedan. He wore his backpack, heart pounding, but what caught him off guard wasn't Tyler's mocking laugh or Chad Drayton's judgmental stare. It was the man stepping out of the car across the street. Graham Ellison, clad in a sharp navy blue suit, walked with calm authority. Pinned to his chest was a U.S. Department of Defense security badge bearing the Silver Eagle emblem, granting access to top-secret facilities. Each step he took seemed to hush the air around him. Conversations stopped. Sunglasses were pulled down. No one was sure whether he was a general, an ambassador, or the director of the CIA. But everyone felt the kind of power that doesn't need an introduction. Julian walked beside his father, chin high. Inside Ms. Whitaker's classroom, the energy shifted the moment they walked in. She had been chatting with other parents, smiling broadly. But the moment she saw Julian bring his father forward, her smile froze in mid-air. "Ms. Whitaker," Julian said, trying to steady his voice, "I'd like to introduce you to my father, Graham Ellison." Whitaker forced a smile, but her eyes dropped to the security badge and the unmistakable seal. And her face slowly turned pale. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Ellison," she stammered. Graham extended his hand, firm, calm, just enough grip to let her know he knew everything. "Likewise," he said. "Julian's told me quite a bit about you, and the class." From the corner of the room, Mr. Chad Drayton, a wealthy white parent known for his real estate empire, looked Graham up and down and muttered snidely, "Trouble like that doesn't belong in private schools like this." Graham didn't look at him. He simply handed Ms. Whitaker an envelope embossed with the Pentagon seal. "As requested, I'll be sharing with the students about my work, within the limits of what I'm allowed to disclose." Just then, a soft buzz came from Graham's pocket. A secure message flashed on his encrypted phone. "Break-in attempt. Westbridge network flagged. Internal breach suspected. Agent Lynn." He closed the phone, gave Julian a brief nod, then turned to Ms. Whitaker. "I'll return in a few minutes. The government's calling." And with that, he walked out of the classroom, leaving the room stunned into silence. Graham Ellison moved swiftly down the corridor of Westbridge Academy, his military security badge on full display. People instinctively stepped aside, as if some unspoken authority commanded it. He didn't stop at the reception desk, didn't speak to the principal. He simply unlocked his phone, entered a 6-digit code, and established a secure connection with Agent Jasmine Lynn, the FBI officer overseeing civilian network links to national defense systems. Her voice crackled in his earpiece. "Graham, you need to hear this. A device has infiltrated Westbridge's internal security system. The signal is coming from the basement. The primary suspect is Dmitry Volkov, the school's head of maintenance. He's used fake identities at 2 other schools. All had children of high-level officials. Graham froze. A surge of thought flashed through his mind. They're not just monitoring data, they're preparing for a targeted strike on the students. He responded quickly. Raise the threat level. Keep this within 3 people. You, me, and Brandon Lee. Send me the school's infrastructure schematic, right now. Meanwhile, inside the classroom, Julian sat quietly, his eyes still clouded with confusion from the tense glances exchanged when his father left. Ms. Whitaker tried to regain control of the room with a forced smile, but the invisible weight of Graham's presence still lingered, heavy and undeniable. Student phones were required to stay on silent during Parents' Day. But a faint vibration drew Julian's eyes downward to the tablet on his desk. A strange message had just appeared. No sender, no preview, just a single line of text. Leave the classroom immediately. Head to the music lab. Someone is waiting. Do not tell anyone. Julian's heart pounded. No one knew he had a tablet with him, and no one, except internal tech staff, had the permissions to send messages over the school's network system. He looked up, quickly glancing at Ms. Whitaker, then toward the hallway, completely empty. A chilling yet magnetic intuition tugged at him. Julian slowly stood up, pretending to ask to use the restroom. Whitaker absent-mindedly nodded, but Marcus Boyd, sitting next to Julian, gently tugged on his sleeve. "Where are you going?" "Just for a bit," Julian whispered. "I'll be back." Marcus watched him leave. In his eyes was something only true friends could detect. Caution. Seconds after Julian exited, Marcus quietly pulled a phone from his backpack. He sent a quick message to a number his father, a former police officer, had once told him to memorize. "Julian just left class. Something's wrong. Please help." Julian Ellison moved quickly through the ground floor hallway, his heart pounding. The strange message kept echoing in his mind. "Go to the music lab. Someone is waiting." He didn't know why he believed it, part instinct, part confusion, and part a belief that his father always taught him to respond swiftly to anything unusual. But what was waiting wasn't a revelation. It was a trap. As Julian pushed open the door to the music room, the space was pitch dark. Not a sound. The grand piano remained covered in its white cloth. A dim light filtered through the frosted glass, then blinked off completely. The door clicked shut behind him. A large hand clamped over his mouth. A rough voice whispered into his ear, "Don't scream. If you do, your father dies first." Julian thrashed violently, instincts flaring. He kicked at the man's shin, trying to pry the hand off his face, but a small syringe jabbed into his wrist. Not enough to knock him out, just enough to make him dizzy. The man dragged him into a service corridor behind the music room, a blind spot with no security cameras. At that same moment, Graham Ellison, having just received an alert from Agent Jasmine Lin, was racing across the school grounds. "Jasmine, I need a status report. Julian isn't in his classroom. I checked the student tracking system. There's no signal." "I just picked up an anomaly," Lin replied. "The location ping from his watch sensor shows erratic movement, heading toward the East Wing basement." Graham didn't reply. He turned sharply down a rear corridor, his hand tightening around the Glock at his side. Just like in Syria, every sense came alive. He was no longer Julian's father. He was Graham Ellison, counterintelligence strategist, former commander of covert anti-espionage operations. In the underground maintenance zone beneath the East Wing, the kidnapper opened a heavy steel door leading into a shadowy corridor. And when the flashlight beam hit his face, Julian saw it clearly. The man's face matched a description his father once gave in whispered off-limits stories. A scar ran from his cheekbone down to his jawline. Sergei Marenko. "Your father thinks he can stay hidden forever," Marenko sneered. "We've waited a long time for him to resurface, and now his naive little boy will be the bargaining chip." From the darkness behind them, Graham appeared, flashlight aimed directly at Marenko. His voice echoed through the hallway, "Let the boy go. This is not your battlefield to rewrite the rules." Marenko chuckled. "Oh, I think it is, and now the final piece has arrived. Did you bring the Blackfish Protocol, Graham? Or do you want to hear your son scream first?" The name froze Graham for half a beat. Blackfish Protocol, a top-secret military intelligence algorithm. He once commanded it, and supposedly destroyed it, but they still believed he had it. Graham took slow steps forward, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "I came alone. But you didn't. Every move you've made has been captured by surveillance. Right now, the strike team has this entire building surrounded." A click echoed. Marenko spun around. Marcus Boyd, who had secretly followed via an alternate route, stood just a few steps away, holding up a phone streaming a live broadcast directly to Agent Lin. "Julian, get down," Graham roared. In a flash, Graham lunged. The Glock slipped from his coat pocket. 2 shots rang out. One hit the wall beside Marenko's head. The second tore through his shoulder. Julian dove clear of the man's reach. Marcus dashed in and pulled him behind a fuse cabinet. Agent Jasmine Lin and Brandon Lee burst in through the access door. Marenko collapsed to the floor, gasping through clenched teeth. This is only the beginning. The entire campus of Westbridge Academy had transformed into a secured perimeter. FBI vehicles, counter-terrorism units, K-9 patrols and helicopters hovered overhead. The press hadn't gotten hold of the story yet, but within Washington's inner circles, the shockwaves had already begun. Sergei Marenko, a known hostile from the Syria conflict and a key figure in a high-level tech espionage network, had just been apprehended inside one of the country's most elite private schools, the kind reserved for the children of America's upper echelon. But the bigger shock waited upstairs, on the 3rd floor, in Ms. Whitaker's classroom. Agent Jasmine Lin personally led a technical team through each room. While scanning for thermal signatures and high-frequency radiation, they detected a concealed micro-surveillance device hidden inside the HVAC vent of Classroom 5A, Julian Ellison's class. But what made Jasmine's face pale wasn't the device itself. It was the location, right above the teacher's desk, directly above Ms. Whitaker's seat. Inside the faculty monitoring room, Ms. Whitaker sat frozen, her face drained of color, as Jasmine Lin asked her the first question. "Have you had any contact with a man named Dmitry Volkov, HVAC technician at this school, in the last 3 months?" Whitaker stammered, I once asked him to replace a filter in the AC unit earlier this month. I didn't know." "Were you ever asked to report on students associated with government or military families?" Whitaker paused. Her eyes welled with tears. Her hands trembled. "There was one time," she whispered. "Mr. Volkov said it was a student survey to enhance safety for priority students. I didn't think it was espionage. I only mentioned that Julian Ellison often talked about the Pentagon. I didn't think—" Her voice cracked. She collapsed into herself, speechless. Graham Ellison stood behind the one-way glass, watching, silent. No rage, only the cold stare of a man who had seen worse. In war zones, in betrayal, in chaos. He understood one truth more than most. Where prejudice exists, there are always cracks for darkness to crawl through. Meanwhile, Julian and Marcus sat in a separate room, under medical and psychological supervision. When Julian was told a spy device had been planted in his own classroom, he went still. "They heard everything we said," Julian murmured. "Even when you told me you hated being called a liar," Marcus added. The betrayal, not by an outsider, but by the place they were told was safe, made both boys grow up all at once. That afternoon, during an internal assembly, Principal Everett Shaw stepped to the podium. Facing teachers, parents, and federal officials, he spoke. "I could say much about disappointment or outrage, but the truth is, we failed in our most basic duty, protecting our students. A spy breaching our systems is one thing. A teacher, even unknowingly, facilitating it, that is a failure of ethics and culture." He bowed his head, then turned to Graham Ellison. "Westbridge will change, but the price of today's lesson was nearly your son's life. We will not forget that." Graham nodded silently, eyes unreadable, as if he had predicted every step of this all along. Later that night, in an isolated interrogation room, Sergei Morenko gave a dry, bitter chuckle when Graham walked in. "You won again. But you know this, I was just the hand. Others won't send spies, they'll use people already inside your system." Graham didn't respond. He simply tossed an old photo onto the table, Syria, years ago. Morenko wounded during a raid led by Graham himself. "Back then I spared you," Graham said coldly. "This time I didn't miss. Remember that." That night, Julian fell asleep in the arms of his mother, Dr. Isabel Ellison, who had flown back from a medical conference in Chicago. But this time he didn't cry. He wasn't afraid. He only whispered, "I want to go back to school tomorrow." The FBI's temporary interrogation facility in D.C. was cold as ice. Thick, soundproofed walls and flat fluorescent lights gave the room a sterile, soulless feel. Sergei Morenko sat handcuffed to a chair, sweat still clinging to his forehead, yet the slight smirk on his face made it seem as though everything that had happened was merely the opening act. Behind the one-way mirror, Graham Ellison stood with arms crossed next to Agent Jasmine Lin and Brandon Lee. They had already gathered preliminary testimony, physical evidence from the utility corridor, server logs, and Marcus Boyd's eyewitness statement. But something still didn't add up. Morenko hadn't acted alone. Jasmine leaned in, lowering her voice. He was prepared to be caught. No serious resistance, no data wipes on his handheld. It's like escape was never the goal. Brandon chimed in, pulling up internal surveillance feeds. "We extracted the software from the planted storage drive in the classroom. It's a backdoor, transmitting real-time data out of the school. But here's the twist. It wasn't sending to any offshore server. The signal terminated at a relay tower inside D.C. Graham furrowed his brow. "A domestic intermediary?" Brandon nodded. "The IP address maps to a network zone under the Department of Energy, specifically within the Quantum Energy Research Storage Wing. Only a handful of people who once had clearance to Blackfish Protocol were ever authorized to install anything near that system." A beat of silence passed. Then Graham stepped back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Petrov," he said, "not Morenko. He's just bait." The real target was to misdirect us with a high-profile school kidnapping, while the core asset installs a long-term surveillance channel in the heart of DC. Jasmine frowned. You're sure? Petrov was a senior analyst, Graham said. Vanished after the encryption scandal 2 years ago. He's the only one who knew the Blackfish Protocol's development map while I still oversaw the project. And he has motive, because I'm the one who signed his suspension order. Brandon added, and he'd have reason to start with the school. Graham turned toward him. Exactly. Because when you want to pierce a system, you begin at its weakest point. The children. Back in the interrogation room, Marenko chuckled to himself, though no one had spoken. He lifted his head toward the one-way mirror, as if he knew Graham was watching. We're all just pawns, Graham, he muttered. But the right pawn can topple the whole board, if it's played correctly. Graham walked down a long hallway leading to the facility's rear courtyard. Outside, the golden haze of late afternoon spilled across the rooftops. In the distance, Westbridge Academy stood on the horizon. Laughter from children playing sports echoed faintly, an eerie contrast to the map Graham was now redrawing in his head. A map of internal national security. Jasmine caught up beside him, walking briskly. What are you planning next? Graham didn't stop. I need a meeting with the Secretary of Defense. We're escalating the entire system to Tier 1 alert. Not just because of Westbridge. And the public-facing explanation, she asked. He turned, voice like steel. We won't say a 10-year-old was nearly kidnapped in broad daylight. We'll say the FBI stopped a covert attempt to exfiltrate national security data through the educational infrastructure, before anyone even noticed. Jasmine nodded slowly. Her eyes, though trained to be sharp, softened for a moment. What about Julian? Graham paused, then in a voice barely above a whisper, he's learned the price of truth. Far too early, but if anyone can carry that weight, it's my son. The next morning, a cold grey sky loomed over Washington, D.C. There were no headlines mentioning the name Sergei Marenko. No televised news reports spoke of a kidnapping attempt at Westbridge Academy. Every piece of information was locked away under the highest level of classified clearance, a silent victory in its truest form. But inside the prestigious school, nothing was the same. Classroom 5A was unusually quiet. Students whispered instead of speaking aloud. Ms. Whitaker was nowhere to be seen. Her chair remained empty. A temporary substitute had been assigned, with no explanation given. Julian Ellison sat next to Marcus Boyd, slowly flipping through his notebook. He said nothing, but his gaze no longer dropped to the floor as it had in those early weeks. Now he looked forward, calm, sharp, as if the illusion of a safe school had been ripped away, revealing a harder truth underneath. Upstairs in the boardroom, Principal Everett Shaw stood before a long row of parents, board members, and 3 plainclothes FBI agents. I won't begin with an apology, he said, his tone stripped of the usual polish. I'll begin with an admission. Westbridge Academy was breached, not by a hacker or high-tech spy, but by our own arrogance, by believing truth only comes from those who look like us. His eyes shifted to the man seated at the far end of the table, Graham Ellison. No military uniform, no name placard, just quiet presence. We laughed at Julian Ellison, Shaw continued. We allowed a teacher to humiliate a child, not because he lied, but because we weren't ready to believe truth could come from a black family without a badge of wealth or power pinned to their name. Graham made no gesture in return, but his eyes made it clear. He heard every word. We commit to a full review of our hiring protocols, our security evaluation systems, and, most importantly, our school culture. No one, teacher or student, will be doubted again based on where they come from or the color of their skin. Applause followed, hesitant at first, but genuine. From the back row, a woman rose. It was Dr. Isabel Ellison, Julian's mother. She had only just returned from a medical conference in Chicago hours before. Her eyes were red, but her voice steady. "The only thing I ask is that my son be allowed to tell his story, in his words. Not through adult spokespeople, not through curated press releases. Every child has the right to speak about what it feels like, to be doubted, to be humiliated, and to rise again." Principal Shaw nodded. He will be invited to speak at the upcoming student forum, and his voice will be heard. A few days later, in the school's small auditorium, an internal assembly was held. No reporters, no cameras, just students, teachers, and a single microphone on a circular stage. Julian Ellison stepped up. He carried nothing but a small folded piece of paper. He stood still in the center, trembling slightly at first. But then he saw his father, Graham, sitting quietly in the back, smiling. Next to him sat his mother, holding his hand. And from the far corner, Marcus Boyd gave him a thumbs up. Julian took a deep breath. "I used to think staying silent was the best way to avoid trouble," he began. "But then I realized, if I didn't speak up, maybe no one else would either. I was called a liar, a show-off. I was laughed at for telling the truth." The room went completely silent. But then I learned, truth doesn't disappear just because people don't believe it. It waits for someone brave enough to hold on to it. Applause rose, no longer hesitant. Marcus was the first to stand, then another student, and then the entire auditorium. Graham Ellison bowed his head slightly, not out of pride, but out of relief. His son, in quiet strength, had lived the lesson he'd once taught. What is right doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand firm. 3 days after the student forum, Julian Ellison found a handwritten note. Blue ink on lined paper, sealed in an unmarked envelope, placed discreetly inside his desk in classroom 5A. He opened it and read each line. "Julian, you don't have to forgive me, but I need to apologize, not just for what I said, but for what I stayed silent about when you were being hurt. I let bias seep into how I saw my students, and I enabled a system that wounded you. Ms. Whitaker." Julian folded the note, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't cry, but something heavy in his chest had just grown a little lighter. That afternoon, in the temporary teacher's lounge, Ms. Whitaker, returning to school for the first time since her interrogation, stood in front of Class 5A. No more fitted dresses, no crimson lipstick. She wore a plain white blouse, dark slacks, and no makeup. Her voice was low, rough, but unwavering. "I want to tell this class something. I was wrong. Not just for insulting Julian, but for not believing him. And for teaching you to believe something untrue, that only certain types of people deserve to be heard." The students sat silently. A few glanced toward Julian. "That's why I'll be joining the Department of Education's Bias-Free Dialogue initiative, and I invite any student who wants to join me to help build a classroom where no truth is dismissed because of who says it." She turned to Julian. "Julian, you don't have to forgive me, but I want you to know, you made me re-evaluate my entire career. And if there's anyone who can help change this system, it's you." Julian looked at her. After a moment, he stood up. He didn't smile, but he nodded. "I'll join, but not to help you, to make sure the kids after me don't have to go through the same thing." A few weeks later, at a federal symposium on school security reform, Julian Ellison was the only student among a panel of experts. He shared his story at Westbridge, from prejudice to surveillance to being doubted because of the color of his skin, and for telling the truth. Officials from defense, education, and media sat and listened, not because he was the son of Graham Ellison, but because he had lived what most still dismissed as a minor incident. As for Graham, he sat quietly in the last row in plain clothes, no credentials displayed. When the session ended, a three-star general turned to him. "Your son doesn't need this system to protect him. This system needs him if it hopes to be fixed." Graham gave a quiet smile. "He's not like me," he said softly. "He's stronger than I ever was." It was an early summer afternoon at Westbridge Academy. The American flag fluttered gently under the golden sunlight. Students gathered in clusters around stone benches, chatting, reviewing notes, or simply enjoying the calm that had returned after the storm named Marenko. Julian Ellison sat beneath the shade of a tree next to Marcus Boyd. The two boys were no longer just ordinary kids. They had been through more than most of their classmates could ever imagine. But today, Julian's eyes no longer carried uncertainty, only a clarity and depth forged in darkness and carried forward with purpose. "You think we'll ever go back to the way things were?" Marcus asked, voice low. Julian shook his head. And I don't want to." A voice came over the school intercom, crisp and formal, Principal Everett Shaw. "Would student Julian Ellison please report to the main office? You've just been nominated by the School Security Commission to serve as the student representative for the Safe and Fair Schools Initiative. Congratulations." Marcus slapped Julian on the back. "Go on, national hero." Julian blushed but smiled. He stood up and walked toward the main building. Each step was an answer, to the stares of disbelief, to the mocking laughter, to the denials of truth that once kept him silent. That evening at home, Graham Ellison sat in his study. On his laptop screen was a policy proposal for reforming civilian school security oversight, drafted at the request of the Department of Education. One of the first provisions read, "No individual, teacher, or staff shall make biased assessments of a student based on background, ethnicity, or family. Every student is a potential node in the nation's security fabric, and every misjudged glance is a breach." The door creaked open. Julian walked in and placed a formal letter on his father's desk. "It's the official invite to be student representative," he said. "I don't really know what to do first, but I think I'll learn." Graham closed the laptop, stood up, and approached his son. "You know what I used to dream of becoming?" he asked, half smiling. "What?" "A spy," Graham replied, "but not the kind that led strike teams or wrote strategies. I wanted to be the kind that made kids safer, starting inside the classroom." Julian nodded. "Then I'll carry that dream forward, but in my own way." Graham looked at his son with pride. "You'll do it better than I ever could, because you're not starting with power, you're starting with truth." The two of them embraced, father and son, in a moment of peace, the kind of peace rarely found in the shadowed world Graham had once walked through. Not everyone who's laughed at is a liar. Not everyone in uniform is the only one fighting, and not every battlefield comes with gunfire. Julian Ellison was just a 10-year-old boy. But he stood up, right in the middle of a classroom thick with prejudice. He didn't shout. He didn't strike back. He simply stood tall and told the truth. And that truth, quiet, unassuming, exposed an international conspiracy and forced an entire system to reckon with itself. That boy wasn't a victim. He was the spark that lit a new kind of conversation, one where truth is no longer measured by skin color, job title, or social rank. Because sometimes we don't need a hero in a cape. We just need one child brave enough to say, "I'm not lying, and I won't stay silent."